Morning, everyone. It's great to see you this morning. I hope it's great to be seen. Good to see you all. Would you stand with me, please, and turn to hymn number 111. Let's read scripture together as we continue our journey through the book of Hebrews. We're in Hebrews chapter 12, and we will read verses 9 through 13 together this morning. I'll get us started here. It says, "Moreover, we have all had human fathers who disciplined us, and we respected them for it. How much more should we submit to the Father of spirits and live?
They disciplined us for a little while, as they thought best, but God disciplines us for our good, in order that we may share in His holiness.
No discipline seems pleasant at the time, but painful. Later on, however, it produces a harvest of righteousness and peace for those who have been trained by it.
Therefore, strengthen your feeble arms and weak knees. Make level paths for your feet, so that the lame may not be disabled, but rather healed."
Let's pray together this morning.
Heavenly Father, we thank you for this opportunity to gather in your name, Lord. Thank you for the beautiful water we've been having. Thank you for all our first responders that are protecting us and keeping everything safe, everyone safe. Lord, we thank you for our master blessing for our military. We ask a blessing on for our all our politicians and all our officials and everyone that wants to help other people. Lord, we just ask for blessings on the message today. In Jesus' name, amen.
God bless. Thank you. So, get your Bibles, and we're going to begin a journey today. It's going to take us a couple of weeks to cover. I thought maybe it would only take one, but it is going to take two. So, as I mentioned last week, excuse me for just a minute. I don't know why I have two of those. Had some questions about why I said what I said about the governor's mask order, and that I was prepared for the first time in at least my very, very long memory to commit a misdemeanor. And I appreciated very much the question for a couple of reasons. One, because it is evidence that people are thinking, and we need to be thinking, and as a matter of fact, before the day's over, you may have more to think about than you want, and we will actually talk about that concept also. The second reason I'm glad is because they asked, because it gives an opportunity maybe to delve a little bit deeper into the subject. I have spent quite a lot of hours the past more than a week researching scripture and topics and searching my own heart. I had to ask myself as I went through this, humbly, say, Lord, am I doing this because I have a rebellious spirit? Am I using this as an opportunity to shake my fist at your duly designated authority? So we're gonna talk about that today. I want you to know that after we made our statement a couple of weeks ago, we had our leadership meeting, and one of the things we discussed was what I said, because they didn't know what I was going to say specifically until I said it, and the agreement that came out of that was okay. So if they want to correct that, they'll have opportunity here. So I'm going to tell you in these next 2 weeks why I how I came to the conclusion and what that conclusion was and why. I'm going to tell you what my thinking process was. I'm going to encourage you to make your own decisions. You have to, and that's part of this process. You must decide. So you have a handout with some PowerPoint slides. I'm going to ask if you can put these up, and I don't have a rear screen. Maybe it'll come up. We're going to begin looking at the PowerPoint, and we're going to use this today to walk down. Yeah, I got one. Wow, there you go. To walk down through this. We will not conclude this today. And there are two reasons. One is because I wasn't going to be able to adequately cover it. As a matter of fact, the farther we get into this, the more questions it will bring. All right? Secondly, I want your input. So, normally after we get done with this, we don't record it, but normally after this we have prayer and question time. What are your prayer requests? What are your questions? What are your testimonies? So at that point, you'll have an opportunity to ask some questions. You will also have some opportunity to ask questions during the week. You'll send me a text or an email or a Marco Polo or tie a note on a rock and throw it through the window. All right, however you wish to communicate. So, and I'm doing that because I want to make sure that when I hit your points, I want to hit what's important to you. So, this is entitled Good and Acceptable, and we're going to use 1 Timothy 2, verses 1 through 4, where it talks about us praying for leaders. And I'll just read it. First of all, that supplications, prayers, intercessions, thanksgiving be made for all men, for kings, and all that are in a high place, that we may lead a tranquil and quiet life in all godliness and gravity. This is good and acceptable in the sight of God, our Savior, who would have all men to be saved and come to the knowledge of the truth. So this is good and acceptable, and that's basically, folks, that says, pray that the government will leave us alone so we can serve the Lord. That's what that is. So we don't have to interfere. Now, I'm going to tell you right up front, no government that's ever been instituted on the face of this earth, or that ever will be instituted, nor the powers of hell, nor Satan himself can keep you from serving God. Having said that, they can make it very difficult. And they can make it very costly, even up to and including our life. But they cannot prevent it. Also, what I'm going to say to you today has more to do with tomorrow probably than it does with the situation that we're in today. There is, I'm not being a prophet, but I have absolutely no reservation in saying that this will happen again. Something like this will happen again. And I'll go out on a limb. We're going to talk about some of this stuff a little bit later, the next 2 weeks. I'll go out on a limb and tell you that in many instances, our churches have set a terrible, terrible government-fearing, not God-fearing precedent. We'll talk about that a little bit later. I'm taking my watch off so I can keep track of the time. It's a symbol that nobody really knows what it means. It probably means nothing, but anyway, there it is. All right, so yeah, Andy, let's look at the next slide. Can you guys see that? All right, the judge upholds suspension of the Pop-Tart gun kit. How many remember this? All right, so I'm sorry, I looked at 2 or 3 of these things. It was a 6 or 8-year-old boy chewed his Pop-Tart into the shape of a pistol and was pointing at the kids and got suspended from school. It was more than 2 years before the case was finally settled. And that's the reason I wanted to put this up here, is that we have in our culture, and I got to throw some of this stuff in here. We have in our culture, and the reason we have in our culture is because to a large degree we have in the church developed this inflexibility, which is why there's a big orange arrow at the top of that slide pointing to zero tolerance. We have developed this inflexibility where we have lost our ability or the will or both to think and make decisions. So we set a standard and we say, all right, there's no variation from this standard. Everyone knows that a Pop-Tart is not a gun. Okay? There is a world of difference between bringing a Pop-Tart to school and bringing a gun to school. And anyone who felt threatened by having I can't say this without you know where I'm going, don't you? By having a Pop-Tart pointed at them has a bigger problem than the person who chewed the Pop-Tart into the shape of a gun. Now, why did you bring this up? And this slide appears a couple times here. Because there is a long-held doctrine on church and state, and it needs to be examined. We have said over and over again that we ought to perhaps forget everything we thought we knew about church. I go to conferences, and it applies here also. I go to conferences, and I know I've told this story before, that I went to a theological conference that had to do with actually a few years ago now, had to do with the Reformation and everything that was coming up because it was the 500th anniversary of the Reformation. And I listened to these intelligent people who had studied and great expertise in their particular topic come and talk about some of their favorite things that they've learned about the Reformation, Martin Luther, and so on and so forth. And at the end, one of the applications, of course, was that the Reformation started Protestants. Protestants are what? Protesters. And it was a rebellion against this damn thing. And so there was this discussion back and forth about, so, and I watched kind of, as this person spoke, I thought, well, you know, I don't know. But they spoke with such authority. And of course they were going down through their notes, and their notes were well written, and so on and so forth. And when they got done, they had a couple questions, and one of the questions was asked by someone who had a very real and personal problem, an issue that they had touched on, and this person asked it and said, look, here's what's going on, and I've got this person that thinks this, and this person thinks this, and I watched the person who made all of those wonderful, well thought through statements back away from them. Theology is made by theologians, and we need their input. But in many instances, it is impractical. It doesn't work. And before we're done with this, and we're going to jump into it next week. Next week, we're going to look at Romans chapter 13. We're going to look at the first 7 chapters, and we're going to tear it apart. And I think you're going to find that it doesn't say what you think it said. Now, I want to read to you a little section here from the Great Study Notes. This is a great Bible, by the way. I love this Bible. It's a Reformation Study Bible. R.C. Sproul is a general editor. English Standard Version. It's got all the things that everybody hates. So I love it. And it gives me lots of things to think about, and it gives me lots of things to argue with. And I write in my Bible, and I've written on this. I've written in here. So there's this it's a study Bible, so it's supposed to have, study notes in it. And so I read this notes, and here's a big gray section. I don't know if you can see this. Big gray section. Civil government. All right? It is the task of the church to preach the gospel, administer the sacraments. And by the way, one of these days we will talk about the word sacrament. All right? We're not going to do that today. Just store that in the back of your mind. Administer the sacraments, nurture the souls of its members, etc. These are not the tasks of the state. It is the state's responsibility, and then here's a list: order society, raise taxes, govern business and society, maintain a standing army, protect life and property. These are not the tasks of the church. The state is given the power of the sword. The church is not. And then he goes on and he actually reprints Romans 13, which is right above here. I don't know why they did that. I'm not going to read all of it. But I just wanted to read you that little section. There is a long-standing, a long-held theological doctrine that church and state that needs to be re-examined. And this is that one does one thing and one does another thing. Now, you have to think, as we're thinking about this, when they say church, what are they talking about? Is he talking about a person? Is he talking about a group of persons? Or is he talking about an organization? So, I think you're going to see here that he's talking about an organization. So the church here that he's talking about is a structure, and that structure's goal is to minister to people and give them communion and nurture their souls and so on and so forth. Store all that away. We'll come back to that a little bit later. But I want you just to stop and think about this for a second. If the church cannot bear the sword, who does? The government who creates a standing army has to put in that standing army or a police force or anything else, because that's what we're dealing with here. We're talking about armed authority in order to enforce the nation's borders or its internal walls. If the church doesn't bear the sword and that government entity does, who do they get to do it? Do they not get persons to do it? All right? So the soldier is not, at least not yet, a robot, programmed. That gave me a terrible 80s flashback right there. So is not a robot program. That person is an individual with a conscience and with a life, responsible whether they know it or not to God for their actions. That is built into all of our structures. So that most of these organizations that have that authority, mortal authority, tell their people, you do not have to obey an unjust order. Bear with me here so far. If that doesn't belong to the church, then who does it? Can a Christian not be in the army, in the military? Use the military abroad. Can a Christian not be in the military or law enforcement? And if a Christian can't do it, then where do we leave it? To whom? Who takes that mantle and does it? People without the restraint of the lordship of Jesus Christ? I don't think any of us want that. We all want people who are going to do this who know that they're going to stand before God and give account for their activity in the United States. And yet the church over the generations and over the years has created this, you can't touch this, you don't touch this, and I won't touch that sort of attitude. And it is false and it doesn't work. Because the Church of Jesus Christ is not an organization, it is people. So, they may make organized, this government entity may make organized decisions, and by the way, when we get to do that, who decides what the standard operating procedures for a law enforcement agency are going to be? People do. Who are those people? Are we going to take, you can't decide that because that's a government thing and you're a Christian. You can't do that. Once again, absolutely not. Heaven forbid. That's not what we want. We do not want Christians to withdraw from that opportunity. So we have this, somewhere along the line, we have this nebulous kind of fuzzy line out here, that this is a government organization and this is a Christian organization. We're going to talk about how how that comes in more in just a minute. So let me go back over this again. We've lost our ability or the will, or both, to make decisions. And so we set these rules. The church has set up this rule. The church has set this up because they don't want to deal with all the complexities that are there. I told you last week, as I was trying to give an introduction to this, that in the ethics book that I have, the Christian ethics book that I have, the author talked about how earlier in his life, he had a strict observance to every speed limit until he talked to a judge or an attorney, I forget now, I have to go back and look, who said to him, well, you know that the posted thing is not really the law, that technically the law is where they enforce it. Apparently, the attorney could go back in, I'm not suggesting go speed and then hire an attorney to do this, but apparently the attorney could go back in and say, you always give everybody 5 miles an hour over the speed limit, why did you ticket my client? You're discriminating on that, that sort of thing. So once he found out that they always fudge a little bit, he inched his speedometer up, or his cruise control. I mean, you understand what I'm saying? I didn't say that. He inched it up. And I thought, well, that's it. As I'm reading the book, I read where the author of the book, and folks, these are great people, and these are hard things. So I'm not making fun of this guy at all. This is hard stuff. This is the kind of stuff we don't want to do because we'd rather kick the kid with the Pop-Tart out than have to think. So he goes on and he says, and he names this man, and he says, this man believes that our American Revolution was a violation of the will of God because of Romans 13. And he says, I do not, the author says, I do not believe that, but he says that, so we agreed to disagree about that. Well, I happen to know, as I was reading this more than a week ago, that man who he mentioned had been ordered by the courts. He's in California. He's meeting there pretty soon. He's in California, and he'd been ordered by the courts not to meet. He was going to meet anyway. So the same guy who earlier said the American Revolution was wrong because they were in rebellion against established authority, a king, when that king came and confiscated property and closed down churches, was now violating the established authority in his local government because they were doing what? Closing down churches. And I'm going to go back to this. I'm going to go back to my theologian thing. It's interesting. It's easy for us to have these high ideals, and we don't have to put them into practice. We have lived in our country in a very comfortable place, where it has been easy to look at the corruption that goes on around about us in high places, and maybe be grateful it didn't affect us, but not have to really deal with it. That's not the case in other places. Today, everything is politicized. Everything. The post office is politicized. Did you see the quote from the lady with less than energetic thought processes? Who saw, this is a famous actress type person, who saw apparently a post office truck broke down and the guy put it on a flatbed. Can you picture this, a post office truck on a flatbed? And she, I don't know if she was joking or not, but she posted, something like, OMG, a guy with a red hat and white letters got out and took the post office truck away. And the implication was that it was a MAGA hat, or whatever you call those, and the guy was stealing the post office truck. Everything is politicized. The weather is politicized. Every time there's an undue storm, it's caused by what? Climate change. And we can go on and on and on. So the famous saying is, we cannot let a crisis go to waste. Government and the political parties need an enemy to fight on our behalf in order to prove their worth and that we need them, even if they have to make one up. Say, why are you talking about all this political stuff? Because, folks, this is where we live. And if we're going to make proper application to Romans chapter 13, we have to understand where we live, and we have to understand where Paul lived, and we'll jump into that a little bit later. Andy, can you throw up the next slide? Who knows who this is whenever it shows up? It's up there. Who is that? Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Dietrich Bonhoeffer was a Lutheran theologian who was hung by the Nazis for his role in the assassination attempt on Hitler. Next slide, please. A little quote, the famous, silence in the face of evil is evil. It is itself evil. God will not hold us guiltless. Not to speak is to speak, not to act is to act. And that's a famous quote from Bonhoeffer, and certainly a hero of the faith. But Bonhoeffer was slow to his final political understanding because of his belief that the church's task was to preach the gospel, and the politics in the state were in other people's hands. In other words, that was out of his jurisdiction. And it took the persuasion of friends and circumstances to get him to change his mind. He was hung by the Nazis a few days before he would have been liberated in 1945. I listened to, I don't know if I mentioned this last week or not, but I listened to a podcast when I can called The Thinking Fellows. It's kind of a peculiar thing. These people are reformed by theological persuasion, and they're either very conservative Lutheran or conservative Presbyterian. There's different people that show up on this thing and talk. I listen to this. And it's basically 3 or 4 guys talking about a theological topic. How many are excited about this? Okay. So I wanted to paint the background. These are not rabble-rousing Pentecostals. All right? These are not Southern Baptists. These are not even Lakeview people who have rifles in their car. These people that I listen to were all from California. So it was an interesting thing. They had a podcast, and you can look it up if you're interested. It's called the 1517 group, and their podcast was called "Is the Church Essential?" And they started the thing by talking about a group of I always have trouble with this word, epidemiologists. Please, Lord, don't help make me say that again. Who made the statement that the demonstrators / rioters, okay, didn't have to wear a mask because racism was a disease and it was worse than COVID. Remember, everything is politicized. Everyone has an agenda. Every crisis needs to be promoted. So I listened to these rather tightly wound guys talk about this, and I was amazed at some of the things they said. And you probably would be too, if you listen to it. I mean, at one point in there, they rejoiced. He said that it was kind of a fun rejoicing thing on July 4th, when all of the fireworks things had been canceled. That all of the people all over the state where there wasn't a fire ban were shooting off fireworks. And where the communities wouldn't do it, the individuals do it. And these guys are kind of saying. One guy said 2 things, very pertinent, I want to share with you. Number 1, he said that many of his minister friends should have listened to their members rather than their peers. He said they took counsel of their peers and their insurance agents and others who said, you'd be careful because if you do the wrong thing, you're going to be sued and this and that and another thing. Instead of listening to their people, he says, I had 2 men who all during this time never missed any of our church meetings, though they have every one of the
high risk.
Thank you. They have every one of the high-risk flags. And it seemed obvious to me that if they got it, it would probably mean their life. And I asked him, and he said, this is important to us, and it's worth the risk. Interesting. This particular fellow, I think it was him, maybe it was one of the other guys, opened up. The moment they were told they could open up, they opened up. And just like us, they were given a whole bunch of guidelines. And what they did was they said to the people, they said, listen, you're adults. You know what to do. Stay away, wash your hands, etc., etc. Just like we did. Apparently there were a group of them, and they all did the same thing. He said, I had people call him and say, what are your requirements? And they said to him, well, here's what we're going to do. You make up your mind. And he said they've had people from other churches come in because other churches are still closed. He said several of us made a call to our denomination, and the denomination said, you guys are on your own. The second thing that was said was one of the men jokingly said, I don't get an opportunity very often, but I had an opportunity to go to another church. He said, I like to do that sometimes to see what everybody else is subjected to, which I thought was an interesting way to put it, a humorous way to put it. And he went on to describe to the extent they were wearing face masks, no singing. They had he said they had a very convoluted communion process, and the same way with the offering. And he said when the minister got up to speak, and then the fellow complimented. He said, I'm glad that they did whatever they needed to do to get their doors open. Okay. But then he said the minister got up to speak and expressed his gratitude that they were allowed to meet again. And then the fellow who was telling the story said, I'm afraid that we have set a terrible precedent. And then he said, if you're that minister in that church, and you just communicated to the church that they're under the authority of the local government, he says, how do you walk back? Folks, Andy, throw up the next slide. And these next three slides I'll probably go through really quickly after I make some original statements. Folks, the press has gone wild. And I know I irritated some people when I called this a pandemic. I did it weeks before Rush Limbaugh did, by the way. I'm not sure that I thought about it, but he's had some other things first. But it is, in my attempt, whether it's the thought of people, it could be, or whether it's a satanic thing, it's been used to destabilize our culture. That and some other things have been used to destabilize our culture. God is not the author of confusion. Now, I have this other place in my notes, so I'm going to throw it in right here with this verse, and you can look that verse up, 1 Corinthians 14, if you wish. God says, let everything be done decently and orderly. So you can look it up. But let me throw this in. How many of us have heard contradictory information about this stuff? You've heard that you can spread it and you can't spread it. You've heard that you can spread it asymptomatically and that you won't spread it. You've heard that you need not have a mask, and you've heard that you need a mask. You heard that this mask works. Oh no, this mask doesn't work. I just saw a study the other day. I was watching the clips of the baseball game, and they all had these little gator things pulled up over their nose. I got one. That's what I put in my. I've got one. Every time I breathe, my glasses fog up, and I'm walking into things. I'm going to have to go to the hospital for a broken face because of COVID. I just saw a study the other day that said those things make it worse because they break it into little particles. And if I read the thing correctly, they did the study by taking moving pictures under special lighting with an iPhone. This is high-tech stuff, folks. Everyone in here can do this study. Just get some water and a thing and spit. All the contradictory information is to keep us from knowing what's really going on. When one person says this time and comes back and says this the next time, how are we to know what to believe? That could be being done on purpose. Press gone wild. God's not the author of confusion. When we know when this first came, and I thought it too, we're all going to die. This thing is so deadly that if it touches you, and then we have these videos that everybody put out, this green cloud, whenever you touch something, a green cloud came up. You see those videos? It turns green, and the next person touched it, and he turned green, and he went over here and touched it, and that person turned green, and pretty soon everybody is all green, and they're all going to die. So, at some point along here, the government had to deal with panic or panic-stricken population. So here's some stats, and these are from last week. I actually put some of these slides together. I think I was going to do this last week, but didn't. So these are a little old. I'm telling you that right up front. You can go look. I don't think the proportions are going to have changed, so I didn't bother changing it. The number of cases across the world is 17 million. We're going to look at some world stats here. You have all this in front of you. You've already sneaked ahead and looked anyway. So there's how many deaths and how many have recovered. Andy, can we see the next slide too? This is in the United States. Coronavirus terrorist cases, 4,735,000. These are also from last week, so I'm sure those numbers have changed. 157,000 deaths and 2 million or so have recovered. Now the next slide talks about population realities. World population is over 7.5 billion. The U.S. population is 331 some odd million. 331 million. The United States is the third most populated country. But the only nations with more population than us are China and India. And we have a greater population. I think Indonesia, if I look, was like 270 million. So we're the third most populated country. Having said that, though, we have less than 5% of the world's population. About 4.4% is what your slide says. Now look at the next slide. Has anyone found it funny that with less than 5% of the world's population, the United States has roughly 25% of the COVID-19 cases and roughly 25% of the COVID-19 deaths worldwide? That's a worldwide number. So we have less than 5% of the population, but around the world, we have 25% of the cases and 25% of the deaths. Now, I'm no mathematical genius, but something's wrong with that. Either we're testing more than other people, or other people aren't testing, or other people, they're just dying, and they're just dying and laying them off in the ditch and not telling anybody. Say, well, why did you stir this up? Because I want you to question this stuff. Something is wrong with that number. Either our numbers are inflated in this country, or the world's numbers are deflated. It is not possible that the country with the best healthcare system in the world has this number of cases. Next slide. I hope you can see this. Well, you got it in front of you. You have to look at it. Now, this is the slide I made, so all of this writing on here is mine. I got the information off the internet. You can, by the way, anything that's on here, you can search. You can look all this up. All right. Just make sure you get it from a somewhat reputable, site. Don't get it from, Billy Bob's Fantastic Figures, because they may not be correct. All right. So, I look back, and by the way, flu is apparently a relatively new thing, because when we get back into the 1800s and earlier, it wasn't flu that killed people. There were other things that killed people. You can look at this all up. There were still plagues, but it wasn't flu. So we'll go down through the thing. It appears that these flu outbreaks seem to have a lifespan that is not dependent upon a vaccine. So let me just give you some of these numbers. From HIV/AIDS, from 2005 to 2012, and the site I found did not have more up-to-date statistics, between 2.2 and 1.6 million deaths annually. That's a cut and paste, so that's what's talking about. Between 1.5 and over 2 million people died worldwide annually. The Hong Kong flu from 1968 to 1970, and by the way, that sounds like a long time, but it was December of 1968 that it first broke out, and it went through 69 and stopped in the spring of 1970. 1.4 million deaths. Asian flu, 1956, 58, I was a little child then, 2 million deaths. Spanish flu, the one we always hear about, it actually wasn't Spanish flu at all, and I'm not going to go into all that, but that's what we learned to call it. From 1918, 1920, 20 to 50 million deaths in a world that was a lot smaller than ours is today. SARS. How many remember SARS? Look at your figures. Worldwide figures in 2003. 8,000 people died of SARS. I don't know if you remember this, but it was on the news every night. We were all supposed to go run around like this. Bird flu. H5N1, 2003 to 2014, 455 deaths. I remember going to a District 3 Homeland Security meeting where they talked about pandemics, and bird flu is one of the things that came up. And they were telling us, if you find a dead bird in your yard, call an authority, don't touch it. I'm glad I didn't find any dead birds, but if I had, I wouldn't have, because I didn't want to be one of these 455 people. Swine flu, 2009, 2010, an estimated 150 to 575,000 people died. The World Health Organization estimates that between 250,000 and 500,000 people die of seasonal flu annually. That is normal. Next slide. Who knows what this is? Woodstock. When was it? 69. A while back. All right. 69. It was the summer of 1969. It was actually this time of year. It was July and August, I think, or something. I knew that when I first looked it up. I don't remember anymore. It was right in the middle of the Hong Kong flu epidemic. This happened in New York. Most of us know what that is. I mean, you could, if you wanted to, don't do it, please. You could, right now, pull up on your search engine, Jimi Hendrix playing the national anthem at Woodstock. Greg's all for it. He's ready to go. All right? And all kinds of things, and you can pull things up there that are vulgar too, so don't do it. But that happened right in the middle of the population. Folks, I was alive then. I was a teenager. I was alive then. I remember Woodstock. I barely remember anything about the flu. Because we didn't talk about it. It wasn't a big deal. Well, all those people died. It wasn't a big deal. Now, let me show you the next slide. Again, this is on your paper, and I'm hoping you're writing some notes down in this. Bird flu pandemic could kill, what's that number? 150 million. This is from The Guardian, an English newspaper, September 30th, 2005. How many people died of the bird flu? 455. Somebody was off. I would say they hit the wrong number on their calculator. Next slide. Swine flu could affect a third of the world's population, says study. How many people died of the swine flu? 575,000 lives. Okay, what's a normal flu year? 500,000. You know, the same fellow who made these two predictions is the same fellow, a guy by the name of Neil Ferguson, who made the predictions about COVID-19. Later lost his job. Well, I don't have time to go into all that. He lost his job because he didn't believe what he was telling everybody else. Let's see the next diagram here. I'm trying to go through this one. This is our famous flattening the curve. How many remember seeing this? Flatten the curve, you know? Yeah, flatten the curve. Famous flatten the curve diagram. And the reason is to protect the healthcare system, and that dashed line across there is the capacity of our healthcare system. So we're going to take this big tall thing down here and we're going to make it flat like that. Can we look at the next slide? The consequence is this. All right? What does that mean? The two arrows are the same number. The one goes way up, and because it goes way up, guess what happens? It has a shorter duration. When we flatten the curve, the end number doesn't change. It just spreads it out over a longer time. Now, there are all sorts of if you're a political cynic, or maybe if you just think, there are all sorts of conclusions that you can draw to. But in the long run, it does not reduce the number of those with the disease. It does not reduce the number of people who need treatment. In other words, flattening the curve is not going to cause someone who would go to the hospital to not go to the hospital when they get it. It's just going to mean that they get it at a later time, and when they get it, they're going to have to go to the hospital because they have these comorbidities. You're with me here so far? When it first started out, flatten the curve, it wasn't about keeping everybody from getting it. It was about keeping the healthcare system from being overwhelmed. And I know some of you who work in the healthcare system, we had people, their whole departments were closed because the hospitals went in the emergency room and they were put on furlough, or they were sent over here to do this, and sent over here to do that, and I couldn't even get an appointment with my doctor. Call in, no, the doctor's not seeing patients. So it basically, flattening the curve basically prolongs the cycle of infection. Next slide, please. These are stats as of 13 of August. So just a couple of days ago. In Indiana, this shows our ICU beds in use in COVID, how many ICU beds are available, and our ventilators in use in COVID, and how many ventilators are available. Almost 80% of the state's ventilators are available, and 33% of our ICU beds are available. Next slide. This is statewide death by day. This is also 13th of August, and you'll see the graph. Now, I'm not a very smart person, but I looked at the arrow. The arrow is the approximate date of the mask mandate announcement. It's been 3 weeks. Can you see the difference it's made in the death rate? Let's look at the next slide. And these, maybe you've seen some of these stats. I mean, these are all, I've taken all of these. These are just screen captures from the Indiana Department of Health COVID dashboard. You guys can look it up and you can look at this. They change them every day at noon, and they update things. And there's a lag in some of them because the hospitals, it takes a while for hospital admissions to get in and death certificates to get processed and all that sort of stuff. But here's where we are. Who dies from COVID-19? And I've got the stats that are on that. 92% of the deaths are 60 and above. Now, let's do some math. If 92% are 60 and above, that means 59 and down make up what? 8%. Now, I'm sorry to tell you that I'm over 60. And I'm feeling low peaking. Just teasing. Okay. What about school kids? 0.1% are school age, 0 to 19. How many in here are 19 or under? Come on, Steve, you're not. The people who aren't putting their hands up, and the people who aren't are. That's how that goes. If you're 20 to 29, you have a 0.3%. Okay? So this thing is, we're still down less than 1%. 40 to 49, it almost gets to 2%. And the highest section in that 50 down age is 50 to 59, which is 5.1% chance. That means, give or take, out of 100 people, 5 people in that age could die from it. 5%. All right, next slide. Number 18. What is that? Face cover. Mask. You say, why are you talking about all this stuff? Because we wouldn't be doing this at all if it wasn't for this disease. So we got to talk about this. We got to put this in the cultural context of where we are. Do masks work? There's studies that say they do. There are other studies that say they don't. I've not seen very many studies that say they help you, keep you from getting it. They're supposed to help you from preventing it. I saw a man a couple of weeks ago, and he explained to me that he was wearing, most of the rest of us weren't. It was before the mandate. He was wearing his mask because he had several health issues, and he was wearing this mask to protect him. Now, I wanted to say to him, that doesn't work. If you're afraid of getting this, stay home. Or get a self-contained breathing apparatus with a tank on the back. So, we don't really know where all this stands because of all of the contradictions. And how would you know? And this mandate went along with some other states. It was done in conjunction with some other states. It was hasty, it was ill-planned, and it was poorly executed. And that's why part of it was rescinded before it was ever written out. And when the statement was made, they asked the governor, is this legal to do? And he says, we've checked with our legal authorities, and yes, it's legal for us to do. And by the time it got done on that Wednesday or Thursday, he made the statement. By the time the thing came out on Monday, whatever it was that came out, it had been changed, and their legal opinions had all switched. Next slide. And I mentioned earlier, I talked about this, we're back to the zero tolerance thing. And I already talked about contradictions. Correct Christian living requires thoughtful application of Scripture. We cannot understand where we're going to be, what we're going to do, how we respond, unless we look at Scripture and we look at it correctly. And if you think that I'm suggesting to you that the common accepted procedure of accepting Romans 13 the way it is incorrect, you're right. I believe it's incorrect. Now, if you'll skip up go up to the next slide. This is 1 Peter 2, 11 through 17, and this is also quoted in conjunction with Romans 13. I'm going to be done here in just a second, so hang on. I highlighted these words on purpose. We're not going to cover this today. We're going to cover this next week. But I highlighted these words on purpose. And they're my emphasis, and it's the way that we can understand this I think better when we get to look at next week. The next slide is Romans 13, verses 1 through 7. I'm not going to take time to read that. I'll let you read it. We're going to talk about it in depth next week, and we're going to tear it apart. We're going to look at it, and we're going to see what was Paul saying. And that takes us to the next slide. We're going to ask ourselves, what was Paul saying? Why did Paul say it? When did Paul say it? Is it absolute? Or is it general? And that should be your last slide. Is that right? All right. I have more to do, but I'm not sharing that. So next week when we gather together, we're going to look at these scriptures. We have all of this as background, our cultural context. How should we respond? What does it mean to us? By the way, I haven't even gotten into this. It's one of those things that we may have an opportunity or may not because of time to deal with. We live in one of the most unique forms of government ever formed on the face of the earth. We live in a government where you are the authority. The people you send to represent you are not your leaders. They're supposed to make decisions based upon your best interest. And some of them won't even let you talk to them. We have to hire people. We have to get together and pool our money and hire people. We pay big salaries to who can go hang around where their office is and talk to them. We call those people what? Lobbyists. Started in the Lincoln administration when they hung out in the lobby of the Hillard Hotel. Because you and I can't pick up the phone. Now, some of our state people we can, and we should. And we should let them know what we're thinking. I've told businesses I'm not coming while you have a mask mandate. I'm in the process of looking to buy a car. They found out about it. They started sending me texts. Because they want me to buy one. And I called them back and said, look, I'm not coming up there to this mask mandate. So why'd you do that? I want to put pressure on them. I wanted that salesperson to go and talk to their manager. And I hope their manager talks to the owner, and I hope the owner owns 50 dealerships across the state, and he gets on the phone and he calls the lieutenant governor. Says, people aren't coming to my business. All right, I'm sorry, I went longer than I had hoped to. I was watching the time. I just couldn't stop in the middle. I am very grateful I didn't try to do the whole thing. Would you stand with me, and while the folks come up to sing, let's pray. Lord, these perhaps are the most critical times for the Church of Jesus Christ that have been faced in a long time. I know that they are, for me, the implications for the church and how they respond to gun leaders are staggering. So I come to you today, Lord, humbly, and I ask that you give wisdom and that you would cover us with your grace, that you would show us how to be the salt and the light we're supposed to be in this world. And I apologize if anything I said was flippant. I get carried away sometimes. I ask you to forgive me of that. Because this is so important, Lord. We can't have a no tolerance policy and stop thinking about it. We've got to test all things and cling tenaciously to your truth. And I know the heart that's here in general, and I pray that you would deepen it and strengthen it, and that you would make us to be lovers of your word, more than lovers of men, more than lovers of their approval, more than lovers of the approval of religious systems. I pray you make us people who are willing to ask why or how or where to anyone where we have that opportunity. And I pray you'd also make us folks who are always ready to give a reason for the hope that lies within us. Make us secure. I pray these things in Jesus' name. Let's sing some choruses. Draw me near. you this week. Take those handouts home with you, if you will, and if you can, bring them back next week. There'll be other slides that we will add to the end of them. Look them over and humbly ask God for wisdom. I thought it was interesting that Rachel said it's the hardest decision she's made in her life. And leaving a job's a hard decision. I pray you don't get any harder. But you probably will. And folks, that's where Christ shines. That's where Jesus is. You depend on him. He's in those, tearful, frustrating, heartbroken moments where we don't know where to put our foot. So go with that humbly with that expectation. God bless you.